And welcome to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. So today on the Jazz Update, George Russell, one of the leading composers and band leaders in jazz. In 1953, he became famous for his Lydian Chromatic concept of tonal organization, which discussed the relationship between chords and scales in jazz music. He grew up in Cincinnati and made his debut performance at age 7 singing a Fats Waller classic. In 1946, he moved to New York City where he would begin performing full-time alongside names like Miles Davis, Charlie Parker and others. Around that time, he began to develop his Lydian Chromatic concept of tonal organization. His theory inspired the styles of several other jazz musicians from John Coltrane to Miles Davis. He produced some outstanding albums from Ezz-thetics, New York, Jazz in the Space Age and more. Some of his best compositions included Living Time, Listen to the Silence and African Game. The latter, an orchestral piece, went on to be awarded 2 Grammy nominations. In the late 80s, he was one of the founders of the International Living Time Orchestra, which still performs today. So that was some insight into the life and times and best hits of George Russell. Also coming up on today's episode, some trending festival and album news. Stay tuned to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva to find out more. We'll be right back after some music. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, George Russell, his life and times and best hits. And during this hour, we're going to be talking about his biography. So, George Russell is one of the leading composers and pianists from the Hall of Fame of Jazz. His ideas have influenced countless other jazz musicians and contributed to the evolution of jazz. He was born in 1932 in Cincinnati. He started out playing the drums as a teenager, then won a scholarship to the prestigious Wilberforce University, which is also attended by other jazz greats like Cootie Williams, Fletcher Henderson, Ben Webster and more. He joined Benny Carter's band in 1941 for a while. He then moved to New York and started touring alongside Gil Evans. His collaborators included Max Roach, Miles Davis, Jerry Mulligan and more. On one occasion, he was commissioned to compose a musical piece for Dizzy Gillespie. The piece went on to be performed at Carnegie Hall in 1947. The piece was called Cubano B, Cubano Bop, featuring Afro-Cuban rhythms and jazz. Another famous composition from that time, Bird in Igor's Yard, which was first performed by Buddy DeFranco. The composition was famous for its fusion themes. It was Miles Davis who inspired him to write a book on chord theory. He started working on a musical theory called Lydian Concept of Tonal Organization, first published in 1963. The theory basically explores the relationship between musical chords and scales. It's one of the most innovative jazz theories. Throughout the 50s, Russell would develop his theory and incorporate it into his performances. In the mid-50s, the George Russell Sextet, featuring himself alongside Art Farmer and Bill Evans, produced an outstanding album called The Jazz Workshop. This album was known for its originality, textures and rhythms that foreshadowed the jazz rock movement of the 70s. Another famous album released from that time, New York, a musical narrative about the city of New York. Collaborating with him on that album were outstanding jazz musicians like Max Roach, Art Farmer, John Coltrane and others. Another great album from the 60s, Ezz-thetics, featuring himself alongside Eric Dolphy and others. In the mid-60s, he took a break from music due to health issues but returned in 1964. He toured Sweden and Norway around that time to massive success. Throughout the late 60s, he developed further on his Lydian Chromatic concept theory. He was also working as a jazz lecturer. Some of the leading venues he performed at included Carnegie Hall, the Village Vanguard and more. He'd also composed extensively works that defined jazz compositions. In 1985, his composition The African Game received 2 Grammy nominations. In 1986, he was invited to tour with an orchestra of American and British musicians by the Contemporary Music Network of the British Council. That led to the founding of the International Living Time Orchestra, which has been performing since then. The band's performances typically feature dynamic rock and funk music. George Russell went on to win numerous awards for his music, MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, the National Endowment for the Arts American Jazz Master, and more. He died in 2009, leaving behind a legacy as a great composer and pianist. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, George Russell, his life and times and best hits. And now it's time for some trending festival news. The Annapolis Jazz and Roots Festival is around the corner, taking place November 1st to 10th. There's artists from all over the world taking the audience on a mesmerizing jazz journey. The festival is taking place at Eastport in Annapolis. So the city of Chesapeake is home to a diverse population, and the Jazz and Roots Music Festival celebrates that diversity. Many of the music performances are themed on the historical context of this diversity. The concerts span music themed on North American, European, Asian and South American music cultures. The festival also features special lectures on the history and culture of music in the location. So this festival is opening up with a performance from award-winning band Verano. Another highlight from the performance, the Jogo Project, an award-winning jazz band from DC. For more information, please visit www.annapolisjazzandrootsfestival.com. So that was some trending festival news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of George Russell's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, George Russell, his life and times and best hits. And during this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first album is called Ezz-thetics, released in 1961. This is one of the definitive albums from his early days. The album's full of avant-garde influenced post-pop tracks. The band that collaborate with him on this album are first class. The album was a hallmark album in the development of jazz. The tracks are similar to the likes of Thelonious Monk and Mingus type songs. Another album called New York, New York, released in 1959. So this album came when Russell was in his early days. There's a lot of jazz classics featuring solos and orchestras. So this one's best described as an album with a musical narrative. The theme of the album is the city of New York. And an album called Electronic Sonata for Souls Loved by Nature, released in 1968. This one's a 14-piece composition taken from a live performance in Norway. A very diverse, unique album blending various elements of classical, avant-garde jazz and so forth. There's 5 original compositions on the album, and it sounds like one long orchestral piece taking the audience on a mind-bending jazz journey, swinging and grooving. So that was a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, George Russell, his life and times and best hits. And during this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Ezz-thetics, released in 1961. So George Russell is an iconic jazz musician. He's everything from drummer and composer to pianist and arranger. This is one of the definitive albums from his early days. The album's full of avant-garde influenced post-pop tracks. The band that collaborate with him on this album are first class. For example, there's Dave Baker sizzling on songs like Ezz-thetic. Eric Dolphy has a very unique take on the song Round Midnight. He's also got some great bass clarinet music going. One of the hallmarks of a great composer which Russell comes across here, his compositions allow all his bandmates to bring out the best in their playing styles, mainly avant-garde jazz here. The music in this album was based on a blend of contemporary jazz and a new type of style that was emerging at the time. The music swings like traditional jazz but also has elements of a tonal jazz in it. All the bandmates are first class. The album was a hallmark album in the development of jazz. It's also got a great flow, combination of swinging, high-energy pieces and slower ones. The tracks are similar to the likes of Thelonious Monk and Charles Mingus type songs. The next album is called New York, New York, released in 1959. So this album came when Russell was in his early days, and the album represents one of the turning points in his career. Backing him on these tracks are an all-star ensemble, from pianist Bill Evans to John Coltrane to Milt Hinton. There's a lot of jazz classics featuring solos and orchestrals like Manhattan, East Side Medley and Autumn in New York. So this one's best described as an album with a musical narrative. The theme of the album is the city of New York. There's 3 Russell originals and 3 jazz classics. There's a star-cast band collaborating with him on the album, from John Coltrane to Milt Hinton and more. There's also a background narration by John Hendricks, who was a famous jazz vocalist, particularly known for his scat singing. There's some great solo performances on the jazz classics, for instance John Coltrane on the song Manhattan. There's a lot of originality on George Russell's compositions, the tunes Manhattan, Rico, Big City Blues and A Hell of a Town. Another album called Electronic Sonata for Souls Loved by Nature, released in 1968. This one's a 14-piece composition taken from a live performance in Norway. A very complex composition featuring bebop, Asian and blues elements, also electronic effects. Joining him on this performance is Red Michel, Jan Gabarek and more. The album features some very advanced concepts at the time, and thanks to digital remastering techniques, listeners can experience how each style seamlessly morphs into the next. This one's a very diverse, unique album, blending various elements of classical, avant-garde jazz and so forth. It's an example of an album that mixes several styles into one. The album came less than a decade after Russell's highly successful Ezz-thetics. Russell's intention was to weave several subgenres of jazz into an electronic piece. There's 5 original compositions on the album. It sounds like one long orchestral piece taking the audience on a mind-bending jazz journey, swinging and grooving. There's also some rock elements in the music. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, George Russell, his life and times and best hits. And now it's time for some trending album news. The album Galactica Rush by singer Jelisa was first released in 1994. It's now being reissued, a remastered version, for the 30th anniversary of that album release. The album was a critical success when it was first released, and it was hailed as a potent brew of jazz, soul and funk. So Jelisa wrote and produced the entire album herself. Here's some highlights from the album. Galactica Rush, an acid jazz track featuring saxophone music. Death of a Soul Diva, an R&B track. And Friendly Pressure, a timeless classic that's gone viral on TikTok ahead of the album reissue. So Jelisa is a Mississippi-based singer who emerged from a background of singers. She started out as a solo artist in the 90s, and her debut album Galactica Rush was an instant success. For more information, please visit inc.to/Galactica Rush 2024. So that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of George Russell's best albums of all time. Stay tuned.